Hey everybody, this is an article from Jungle World uh, titled Hamas and the Blind Spots of the Left. It's by Yves Coleman. It says, traditional left-wing concepts are not enough to analyze Hamas. The reactions of the left to the Hamas, this is like a little, abstract of the little article. The reactions of the left to the Hamas pogrom on the 7th of October range from grotesque apologetics to helpless condemnations. The left on an international scale lacks the terms to adequately describe the phenomenon of political Islam and its anti-Semitism. Before the piece starts, I guess this is a note from Jungle World. The attack by Hamas on the 7th of October was an unprecedented escalation in the war against Israel. It forces us to think again about anti-Semitism, Islamism, and the left. Ernst Lohoff has interpreted Hamas's warfare as an element of an incipient global civil war. That's another piece that I guess they're putting up here. So here we go. Here's the actual article. As far as Hamas is concerned, there seem to be roughly 5 different competing interpretations. 1. Those who think that Hamas is a genuine national liberation movement with a secondary religious component that must be a negotiating partner for Israel. The former Trotskyist Yves Coleman, see if I can find anything on this character. Wikipedia says Yves Coleman is a French political journalist. It says he looks like he directs something called Mediapart, and Mediapart, according to Wikipedia, is an independent French investigative online newspaper created in 2008 by Yves Coleman, former editor-in-chief of Le Monde. Mediapart is published in French, English, and Spanish and has produced hundreds of investigations over the past 15 years on political corruption, financial corruption, and environmental damage, as well as on social, sexual, and police violence. In March 2021, Mediapart reached more than 220,000 paid subscribers. According to Euro/Topics, a newspaper aggregator, published by the German federal government agency, Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, Mediapart's political orientation is left-wing. Back to the text. The former Trotskyist Yves Coleman, now director of Mediapart, a left-wing, quote, independent newspaper, end quote, published online with around 200,000 subscribers, in parentheses, explains in the same text that Hamas is generously financed by Qatar and, quote, instrumentalized by Israel, end quote, but is also a, quote, political movement with a social base, end quote, parenthesis, question mark, end parenthesis, and with, quote, authoritarian practices, end quote, parenthesis, question mark, end parenthesis, that is, quote, one of the parts, now the dominant one, of Palestinian nationalism, end quote. What a hypocrite. The proponents of this timid, quote, thesis, end quote, who carefully avoid asking about the meaning of the name, quote, Islamic resistance movement, end quote, Harakat al-Maqawama al-Islamiyya, or Hamas, whose name does not even mention the, quote, Palestinian national, end quote, range from the far left to moderate left-wing intellectuals or, quote, progressive, end quote, academics who like to invoke, quote, complexity and, quote, context, two magic words that help them mimic the, quote, great thinker, end quote. Ultimately, they all share a classic anti-imperialist position, parenthesis, i.e. a rejection of U.S. or European imperialism alone or primarily. Or a bias towards the, quote, global south, end quote, to use the latest trendy term. Thus, the spectrum ranges from the idealization of Hamas as the, quote, vanguard, end quote, of a struggle against Western imperialism, or the champion of a broader nebulous, quote, revolution, end quote, to those who simply want to give the Palestinians democratic rights in the form of a state, whatever territory that may encompass. Thus, we are dealing with advocates of both a, quote, one state and a, quote, two state, end quote, solution. This, quote, left, end quote, has one more thing in common. It refuses to update the critique of religion that has its origins in the Enlightenment and was continued by the founding figures of Marxism and anarchism. Judaism is an exception to this refusal, which the, quote, anti-imperialists, end quote, consider particularly harmful. Christianity is left out. Parenthesis, the, quote, Christian left, end quote, is not to be discouraged, end parenthesis, but above all Islam. Sorry, one moment. In the name of the fight against so-called Islamophobia. This confused and unprincipled, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, movement used a whole series of questionable arguments. A. In Palestine and the occupied territory, no other policy is possible than armed struggle. B. The, quote, Israelis, end quote, or, quote, the Zionists, end quote, are paying the price for their failure to mobilize mass support for an improvement of the situation of the Palestinians, or for their alleged indifference, or even their, quote, systemic racism, end quote, and, quote, white supremacism, end quote. In other words, quote, he who sows the wind will reap the storm, end quote. C. The Israeli army, an outpost of American imperialism, the best army in the world, is waging a, quote, asymmetric, end quote, war against the poorly armed Hamas fighters. Parenthesis, note how, after the pogroms of October 7th and 8th, those who made this argument were quick to praise Hamas's sophisticated technical skills and military and strategic capabilities, end parenthesis. D. Hamas pogroms are the normal, inevitable consequence of the daily and constant violence perpetrated by the Israeli state and the religious and far-right settlers. E. Hamas is a resistance movement reminiscent of the resistance against the Nazis. F. The West, Europe, or both are the main culprits in the Hamas pogroms. The inimitable Yanis Varoufakis declared, quote, those who try to push people like me or the DM25 movement to condemn the attacks of the Hamas guerrillas will never succeed, and they will not succeed for one simple reason, parenthesis, end parenthesis, the criminals are not Hamas, not even the Israeli settlers who are killing Palestinians. The criminals are us Europeans, we, end quote. G. Israel is about to commit, quote, genocide, end quote, in Gaza, one of the most popular tropes of the well-known, quote, Holocaust reversal, end quote, technique. This technique consists of describing Israel, Israelis, and Jews as Nazis or future Nazis, and declaring that the, quote, Jews, end quote, or, quote, the Zionists, end quote, have all changed from being oppressed to being oppressors, that, quote, the victims have become the executioners, end quote. Is that a direct quote from, maybe I'm wrong, I think it's a quote from Edward Said. This, quote, argument, end quote, is used by left-wing anti-Zionists as well as by far-right and Holocaust-denying anti-Zionists. It's generally used by people who, either out of ignorance or cynicism, blur the distinction between concentration camps, labor camps, and death camps during World War II. Thus, they take the liberty of describing Gaza as a, quote, open-air concentration camp, end quote, parenthesis, with strong connotations of an extermination camp, end parenthesis. In March-April 2002, they compared the Israeli army's attack on the refugee camp in Yemen to the Nazis' is it Jenin or Yenin? I don't know. To the Nazis' attack on the insurgents in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in October 2023, they compared Hamas's genocidal attack on the kibbutzim and the rave party to the, quote, Warsaw Ghetto uprising, end quote. Infamy repeats itself. These 7 pseudo-quote arguments are capable of are part of an, quote, anti-imperialist, end quote, interpretation that, in the Western left, goes back to distant sources, to the theses of Lenin, the Bolsheviks, and the Communist International, defended at the Baku Congress, parenthesis, for the First Congress of the Peoples of the East, end parenthesis, in September 1920. This tradition was continued and expanded after the Second World War by French intellectuals such as Frantz Fanon, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Michel Foucault, and above all by political leaders such as Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara, Che Guevara, Nelson Mandela, as well as the Afro-American movement around Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, parenthesis, Eldridge Cleaver, Huey Newton, Angela Davis, end parenthesis, and even more recently by supporters of Hugo Chavez, Luis Inacio, quote, Lula, end quote, de Silva, Evo Morales, and others, or by feminist intellectuals such as Judith Butler. 2. Those who identify Hamas with the fascist or clerical fascist movement, drawing on Leon Trotsky's analysis of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s, such as the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, a small heterodox group, those who have developed their own analysis of Islamism, drawing mainly on the legacy of Italian autonomia and apparismo, such as the Mouvement Communiste, and finally a Trotskyist group such as Lutte Ouvrière, parenthesis, LO, Workers' Struggle, end parenthesis, which also never harbored any illusions about Islamist currents, describing them as, quote, bourgeois reactionaries, end quote, a rather short-sighted analysis, but one that hits the nail on the head. It should be noted that the LO has so far underestimated anti-Semitism on the left, unlike the other 2 groups mentioned, which are much more nuanced and awoken on the subject. 3. Those who, whether from a right-wing or even extreme right or even social democratic position, analyze Hamas as a fascist or Nazi organization and political Islam as a, quote, new fascism, end quote, or a, quote, new Nazism, end quote. The representatives of this position range from the Republican Party in the United States to the Conseil Représentatif des Institutions Juives de France, the umbrella organization of Jewish communities in France. Also included are a number of politically moderate intellectuals who can be classified as center-right or center-left. These people generally share the thesis of a, quote, conflict, end quote, or, parenthesis, more often, end parenthesis, a, quote, war of civilizations, end quote, sometimes more openly, sometimes less extreme. 4. Those who consider Hamas a, quote, totalitarian, end quote, movement without thinking deeply about the term, or people who use the term totalitarianism but go further and describe all religions as totalitarian, parenthesis, classical anarchists, and probably many others who cannot decide which term to use, end parenthesis. 5. A small minority of very radical activists who think that the national question has been obsolete for a century. Anything that is not 100% communist is considered reactionary to them and deserves all sorts of negative labels, but without really addressing the questions raised by political Islam. This discussion is further complicated by the fact that the term political Islam encompasses many different organizations, those that may or may not use violence, those that are or have been in power. On this general question, the same diverse positions can be found, from those who believe that political Islam is the ideology of peoples oppressed by the, quote, global north, end quote, or the West, to those who believe that political Islam is a new fascist and or totalitarian ideology, without making any distinction between Turkey, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, the, quote, Islamic State, end quote, and jihadist terrorist terrorist movements. Between these 2 extreme positions are those who consider the Tunisian Al-Nahda Party, the Islamic Salvation Front, Front Islamique du Salut in Algeria, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and the Justice and Development Party in Turkey to be contemporary Islamic equivalents of the Christian Democratic Party in Italy or the former Popular Republican Movement, Mouvement Républicain Populaire, MRP, in France, or if they do not yet correspond to those models today, they could at least do so tomorrow if the Western states stop being, quote, Islamophobic, end quote. None of these broadly outlined positions seems satisfactory, none of them manages to grasp all the dimensions of the problem together, and none of them offers a genuine analysis of the social and political role of the Islamic religion in all its forms. Does it irrevocably mix religious and political aspects? In which case, there would be no hope without a major religious reform that could take centuries to arrive, and of the various movements that claim to be part of political Islam. Since the 1979 revolution in Iran in particular, ideological, political, and even military competition has emerged between various Sunni and Shia groups, and the political picture has become much more complex due to mutual influences. It is also necessary to assess the role of the Salafists, who are presented by some experts as harmless religious sectarians, and by others as facilitators in the development of jihadist terrorism. Who should we believe? If any analysis of political Islam is reduced to abstract criticism, however justified, of nationalism, totalitarianism, fascism, or unbridled hatred of the West and its, quote, secular and democratic values, end quote, all elements that are present to varying degrees in Hamas and political Islam, end parenthesis. It means that we have not developed new tools for analyzing a phenomenon that is relatively new, in terms of its scale and immediate consequences, end and that takes on forms that have never been seen before. Finally, if we rely only on the explanatory schemes mentioned above, we no longer need to analyze Hamas or political Islam in detail in order to understand and describe them, because all possible hypotheses to explain them have already been put forward by a century of Marxists, anarchists, and defenders of bourgeois democracy. It is, of course, essential to denounce Hamas and political Islam as the enemy of the working class, and there is no need to debate endlessly about appropriate or inappropriate uses of the term, quote, terrorism, end quote, about the legal concept of, quote, war crimes, or, quote, crimes against humanity, end quote, or even about massacres of civilians in the name of a certain, quote, resistance, end quote, as a good part of the left and the far left have done in France and the rest of the world. Similarly, it is essential to condemn Muslim anti-Judaism, linked to some very old theological interpretations of the Quran, and the anti-Semitism of political Islam, which takes forms that extend to neo-Nazi Holocaust denial and annihilation fantasies. But this is not enough. We must put forward new arguments based on concrete knowledge, but especially on new concepts. Just a small example. On the 10th of October 2023, during a broadcast by the left-wing independent online media, Les Médias, the tandem Dominique Vidal and Xavier Guignard argued that Hamas had changed and modified its charter. One second. Seeing if anything comes up for these people. I'm not really finding anything that seems easy to navigate, so moving on. Just a small example. On the 10th of October 2023, during a broadcast by left-wing independent online media, the Média, the tandem Dominique Vidal and Xavier Guignard argued that Hamas had changed and modified its charter. But a few days later, on October 16th, Mediapart published an article quoting Hamas political leader Khaled Mashal as making a statement that completely contradicts the argument put forward by the authority of the Vidal-Guignard duo. Quote, however, the 1988 charter is not obsolete, end quote. Khaled Mashal, one of Hamas's founding members, told researcher Laila Sarat, quote, Hamas refuses to submit to the wishes of other states. Their political thinking is never the result of external pressure. Our principle is not to change the document, parenthesis, he's referring to the, quote, document of general principles and guidelines, end quote, published by Hamas in 2017, end parenthesis. Hamas has not forgotten its past. Nevertheless, our charter describes the period of the 1980s, and the document describes our position in 2017. Each period has its own text. This evolution should not be seen as a departure from the original principles, but rather as a derivation, parenthesis, ishtikak, end parenthesis, of the thinking and tools that best serve our cause at its current stage. And Wikipedia says, Khaled Mashal, born May 1956, is a Palestinian politician who served as chairman of the Hamas Political Bureau from 1996 until May 2017, where he was succeeded by Ismail Haniyeh. Khaled Mashal was regarded as one of the most prominent leaders of Hamas since the death of Ahmed Yassin, alongside Ismail Haniyeh. Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip during the 1967 Six-Day War forced Mashal's family to flee, and he has since then lived in other parts of the Arab world in exile. For that reason, he was considered part of Hamas's, quote, external leadership, end quote. After the founding of Hamas in the wake of the first Intifada against the Israeli occupation in 1987, Mashal became the leader of the Kuwaiti branch of the organization. In 1992, Mashal became a founding member of Hamas's Politburo and its chairman. Mashal became the recognized head of Hamas after Israel assassinated both Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and his successor Abdel Aziz al-Rantisi in the spring of 2004. Under his leadership, Hamas secured a surprise majority of the seats in the Palestinian legislative election in 2006. Mashal stepped down as Hamas's Politburo chairman at the end of his term limit in 2017. Back to the text. If we do not have reliable answers to such a simple question, parenthesis, has Hamas's anti-Semitic conspiracy theoretical and genocidal 1988 charter been abrogated or not, and how, and parenthesis, or if left-wing intellectuals or academic radicals, intentionally or not, ignore facts, then it is not surprising that we are lost when it comes to analyzing the character of Hamas. Incidentally, sociologist Laila Sarat, who wrote the article quoting the Hamas's leader's statement, wrote on the 1st of May 2017, quote, Hamas is not ready for a new armed confrontation with Israel after its 3 consecutive military operations since 2009, end quote. Says that Laila Sarat is senior lecturer at Sciences Po Paris France, and associate researcher at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, France. She has a doctorate in political science and from the Paris Institute of Political Studies. Back to the text. Far be it from me to criticize Leila Surratt for her erroneous prognosis, since I neither possess her knowledge of the subject nor am I able to formulate a theoretical analysis as an alternative to the popular interpretations of political Islam in general and Hamas in particular. But is this monumental miscalculation not linked to a lack of understanding, parenthesis, or at least an inadequate understanding, end parenthesis, of the deeply reactionary, anti-proletarian, anti-communist, pro-capitalist, genocidal character of this organization? And a great deal of thought is still needed. So far, Marxist and anarchist concepts have not been able to accomplish this task, apart from a few timeless slogans, sometimes right, parenthesis, against the war, exclamation point, end parenthesis, and sometimes completely wrong, parenthesis, long live the class struggle, exclamation point, end parenthesis, but hopelessly inadequate to help effectively those who are exposed to bombs and bullets every day in the Middle East. While we wait for more solid analyses, we must at least listen to the words of the survivors of the Hamas-organized pogrom, rather than those of the, quote, experts, end quote, or politicians, and we must support those Israeli and Palestinian activists who do not speak for Hamas and try to work together as their communiques demand. Thanks for listening.